Hello and welcome to Beyond Intelligence, where we'll be exploring the extraordinary potential of human beings when we move beyond our cognitive intelligence. We're going to be focusing on the capacities and abilities that we can develop when we stop defining ourselves in terms of the cognitive intelligence that we learnt when we were at school and that is prioritized in our academic tradition and also largely in our public media, which is very mind-focused. This video blog is not going to be against the mind. It's going to put the mind into the right place. And we're going to have a look at the kinds of abilities that we can develop when we use other capacities beyond the mind. For example, our very rich array of subtle senses, our ability for wisdom, the human spirit, our spiritual capacities, our capacities that sit around our understanding now and knowledge and experience with life energy, which has a long tradition also of developing special abilities or superpowers, as I call them. So there's a very rich world that sits beyond the cognitive intelligence that we tend to work with all the time, especially through our written materials. This is an area that I've been exploring for more than 35 years now. I started by diving into the world of Chinese masters and their extraordinary understanding of life energy, how all of life works through this flow of energy around the planet, around the universe, and around and through us and our own bodies and systems. And that gave me a completely different perspective in terms of what's possible for us as human beings when we go beyond our normal capacities. I started in an environment where people were healing themselves in a very natural way through the use of life energy, as the Chinese masters call it, or qi. And it was completely different from the way that we typically think about healing in Western medicine and Western culture. So that opened my eyes to something that was different, significantly different from what we were used to. And then I just got more and more and more curious about what's really possible for us when we open ourselves up to more. When I was about 13 years old, I had an English teacher at school who told me that we only use 5% of our brain, which interested me immediately. And what's the rest of the other 95% doing? She also told me the thing that I think so many of us have been told is that from the age of about 18, our brain capacity goes down because our brain cells are dying. And that felt like a really strange mix to me, that we were using a tiny fraction of this capacity that we have. And very soon, in 5 years at that time, my capacity was also going to start shrinking. And I suspect that there was something inside me that even knew at that time that that wasn't fully true. So it caught my attention. And I would say a lot of my life, in a way, has been exploring how that turns out not to be true. And that was really quite a long time before the research came through, which showed us that it's not true that our brain cells are dying all the time. In fact, it turns out that we are creating brain cells all the way through our life. But for me, what we're really talking about here goes beyond the brain. We tend to think about everything in terms of the brain being the primary organ of our body that does all of the work. My experience with energy shows that a lot of what's going on isn't happening in here. It isn't even really happening within my body. What's actually much more interesting is the relationship between me, my mind, my body, the energy of life, and then the energy of everything that's going on around me. So it becomes a kind of relational exploration rather than just what comes up inside me, separated, isolated from the rest of life. It's like what's possible when we recognize this much broader experience of life that actually every single one of us is capable of experiencing. I've worked a lot with highly sensitive people, and highly sensitive people tend to have a more a stronger capacity for subtle sensing. What that means is they sense all kinds of things, not through their 5 physical senses, but through what we can call their subtle senses that you would not necessarily sense if you're not highly sensitive. So highly sensitive people are the people who can feel what you're feeling, even if you're not sure what you're feeling yourself. They're people who walk into a room and they can read the energy of the room instantly. They have a more refined capacity for sensing through a multitude of different ways. And this work has been really interesting for me as a highly sensitive person also, because that has pushed me to really learn what's possible when we turn on these subtle senses rather than turning them off, which is typically what happens in mainstream education and also often in family life. So when we turn on our subtle senses, we turn on our capacity for working with the subtle energy realm, which is all around us and is woven through all of life, then we start to turn on a potential for our own lives that is completely impossible if you stay locked in the world of cognitive intelligence. And let's speak a little bit now about artificial intelligence, because of course, that's a very big context for this kind of work now. Artificial intelligence and the potential for placing technology inside our bodies that uses artificial intelligence in very extraordinary ways to enhance our capacities is a physical or material way of kind of matching what I'm talking about. But my experience of life has shown that when we use artificial enhancements to our capacity, they tend to downgrade or decrease our capacity. Whereas when we grow our natural inborn capacities, then they become stronger. Why is this important? It's important because if we want to experience the things that most of us long for as human beings, like joy and freedom and inner peace and even world peace, and things like healing rather than having to take medicine as a cure for an illness, we need to grow these innate capacities and not replace them with artificial capacities. Now, that doesn't mean we should never use any technology, but it does mean that we should recognize that when we use technology, we are making a choice to downgrade part of our own capacity. And a simple way of seeing that is that when we use machines, for example, to help us with physical work, we typically become less physically strong. That's totally obvious. And so now many people going to the gym to try to replicate the kind of strength that they might have had if they were living on the land, doing everything by hand, as people used to do only a few generations ago. Now, that doesn't mean that we should be living on the land. We make choices about how we want to live. But it does mean that if we don't use our physical body in the ways that we have done in the past, we will lose that physical strength unless we build it up in another way. The same is true of the mind. If we don't use the mind, it becomes lazy and sluggish and it doesn't work so well. But what I want to show you through this video blog, Beyond Intelligence, is that we have put our mind into the wrong place. We have given it the role of being the director of our life, of being the leader, if you like, the part of us that we make all our decisions with. And my experience has shown that the mind is not a natural leader. It is not a director. It is being put into the wrong role. It actually does not have the capacity to discern wise decisions. It can have the capacity to work through a lot of material to find out what is a rational decision. But if we want to make wise decisions, we need to use more than the mind to get there. For example, we need to also bring in our capacity for love, our heart, because if we make a rational decision that doesn't take account of love, we often make really serious mistakes in the long term because we don't account for the things that actually matter to us as human beings. I would say that if we use our mind to the exclusion of our world of energy and of our spirituality, our true sense of who we are as a human being living this life, why we're here, how we relate with life itself, or with what we can say is beyond the material world, the intangible world, the world of spirit, the world of spirituality, the world of God or Great Spirit or life itself, then we're missing out on a fundamental part of our experience, and we are unable to make decisions that align with our sense of purpose and our deeply held values and our sense of there being something more in the world than just this small human being who is very limited in my capacity if this is all that I am. If I'm part of something that is a connected world, then I become much more than the pure, simple physical body that you see sitting in front of you. So these are very important topics because we are facing imminently the possibility of being able to put chips inside our body that start to be able to take over some of our capacities. Now, this is clearly a free choice. Nobody's going to say what you should or shouldn't do, but I think it's really important to understand the consequences of it. And particularly that what I want to explore in this video blog is that putting chips inside you that are super intelligent, so greatly enhance your cognitive intelligence, is not going to improve the entirety of your being. In fact, by putting such an emphasis on intelligence as we typically define it, it's going to diminish other parts of your being because that intelligence then becomes so strong. And I've already indicated that I don't even believe it's the right way to lead life. We have better capacities for making decisions than our intelligence. It informs our decisions, but it is not the heart and it is not the leader. It is not the leading edge of decision making. It is not the source of wisdom. So by so enhancing our intelligence internally to the extent that potentially, as is being planned and created, it can manage our emotions, it can manage all our systems inside our body, it can replace our organs. Ultimately, there are many different things that are going to become possible. We start to lose the other capacities we have that are actually much more powerful than intelligence. This is what's really important about this topic. When you bring intelligence together with the intelligence that's in your heart, the intelligence that's in your gut, that kind of deep sensory intelligence that you have, not physical senses, but just a deep knowing. When you bring it together with the fact that you are connected with every part of life, with every part of the universe, both the visible and the invisible. And that gives you access through your subtle senses to a vast array of subtle information, which is much, much richer than cognitive information. And when you take into account your spiritual connection with everything, the fact that you are a part of life, you are a part of creation, the formation of life in every moment. You are participating in that. You're not separate from it, looking at it. You're not a machine in there being kind of wound up with gears and cogs and things like that. You are an intrinsic part of living nature, of life living itself. And when you start to factor that into your decisions, into the way that you live, into the way that you think and feel and tell stories, you become a much, much richer human being than you could ever be if you massively magnify your cognitive intelligence and don't grow your other intelligences. So, what I feel is important about this is how we keep these in balance, how we allow the mind and intelligence to sit in the right place in our life, how we enable and empower our other capacities, our other abilities. You could call them intelligences if you like, our subtle energy intelligence, but we're going way beyond here the cognitive intelligence. How do we do that, and what becomes possible for us as a result? And this, for me, is the frontier territory today of human life. This is the leading edge exploration of our life. This is where we are able to experiment at a very deep level, and also in our outer life. We can experiment through our business, through our relationships, through our family, through our community, through our politics, through our social and organizational and governance systems. This is an extraordinary world in which we're able to experiment with our true human potential and how we actualize or realize some of that missing 95%, which is probably not in the brain at all. But no doubt, as it comes on stream, the brain will also come on stream at the same time, because as you start to work with one part, it will start to work through all the different parts. So, if this is intriguing for you, I'll close by sharing a little bit of my own experience in these areas. Because what's very important about this is that I don't want to just talk about something that I don't know much about or that I've read about in books. I want to talk from experience. Around 35 years ago, I met my first Chinese master in London. His name was Zhijing Wang. He was an extraordinary person who was teaching Qigong. There are thousands of forms of Qigong, and I was studying one that was called Huagong. And I remember when I went to my first session, I had no idea what was going on. I'd never done anything like that before. I'd been invited by a friend, and he was leading us in these exercises, and other people were clearly having an extraordinary experience. It was obviously very beautiful for them. I was completely unable to feel anything. I just followed the instructions, stood in the poses or did the movements, and nothing happened. But I was intrigued all the same, and so I had another go, and I went a few times, and a few weeks later we were doing exercises in the park, and suddenly I felt as if my arms were being held. It was literally as if, almost like as if there was a plaster cast around them or something that was holding them in position. And it was a position rather like this, but lower down, where normally after a little while your arms get tired and you want to put them down. But they were being held up and I wasn't tired. And I was like, oh my goodness, that is something I have never experienced in my life. And I knew that it was the energy that he was teaching us about. And that got me kind of hooked into exploring what is this thing that can hold my arms up without them getting tired and feels like something around them, like a casing or a warmth or a just like a padding around them, holding them from every angle. And there's nothing there. I can't see anything. It was almost like a physical experience, but there was nothing physical there. I then went through many years of often feeling like I don't know what's going on. I can't feel anything. I was very British, very unemotional, very controlled, and I had a lot to learn in this space. But I was really persistent. I used to practice every day, as we were supposed to do, and I went to the lessons every week and weekends and week courses and things like that. And I started to learn about energy. And my teacher was wonderful because sometimes he would sit down for an hour or two or three and just talk to us about energy in what he called a heart-to-heart transmission. So we used to close our eyes and listen, and we didn't listen with our ears and our minds. It was like we were listening with our being. And at first I couldn't do that. I just took in the words, and I often found it very challenging. I couldn't even sit cross-legged in those days, and we were supposed to sit cross-legged, and it was agonizingly uncomfortable for me, and I was wriggling around, couldn't sit still. But after a few years of this, I remember very clearly being able to sit for an hour or 2 hours in this Like I was hearing everything he said, but it was as if I was processing it through my being, not through my mind. And I couldn't really remember the words afterwards, but if somebody would ask me what he talked about, I had total recall of it. It was extraordinary. Every single thing he'd said had gone through somehow into my system. And so people would sometimes come and ask me, what did he talk about? Because they'd fallen asleep or missed some of it or got caught up in their thinking. So this was another very extraordinary experience for me, built on many others, years of releasing, kind of coming to know myself emotionally, waking up, all kinds of things, and being exposed also to talk and demonstrations of special abilities. He was a healer, and so he was working on healing people. And sometimes we would have these very, very deep healing sessions. And look, I wasn't there because I was sick. So I didn't have that experience of healing myself, except that things like I never had another migraine. I used to get migraines every 6 weeks or so. All of my life until I started doing this Qigong, and I've never had another one since. I've never had a headache since I started doing that. All kinds of, I used to have a kind of asthma, and I was given inhalers, and I remember trying my inhaler the first time after I'd started doing Qigong, and I threw it away immediately because I could literally feel that this is not doing my body any good. I don't want to be using this. And so my health improved, but I wasn't there for that purpose. But there were people there with cancer and really serious diseases. And so I was witnessing this healing of people, them reporting getting better results from their doctors by my teacher. And so I got steeped in the knowledge which comes from the ancient Chinese tradition of special abilities that come through the cultivation of our subtle life energy, our qi. And occasionally he would do demonstrations. And I remember one very clearly with one of his top students, one who'd really got it very well. And they were demonstrating how they could tune into the Chinese Beijing opera, which is a very specialized form of opera, and with no training whatsoever, sing Chinese opera. It was quite extraordinary. And then they did another demonstration where they tuned into Kung Fu without having experience in training Kung Fu. And the words that they would use is, I can connect with the channel of Kung Fu. And then they were able to do Kung Fu moves. And I had a partner at that time who went to Burma and met a monk who could speak whatever language and dialect and accent of the person who was sitting in front of him. So if there was somebody from Birmingham in the UK sitting in front of him, he would speak with a Birmingham accent in English. If there was somebody from the south of France, he would speak French with a southern accent. Extraordinary. I didn't meet this person, but I started hearing all of these kinds of stories. So, of course, you naturally get curious about this kind of thing. I went on after a while to work with another Chinese master who continued in that vein, and we were working with energy for everything, for health and healing, for our relationships, for business, for every single thing that we did. We experienced it through the lens of life energy, human energy, life energy. And I did that for another 15 years. So I had 22 years of training with Chinese masters. And therefore, I have a very deep knowledge that has come from practice and experience of energy and of how it works. And then throughout that time, I was also teaching people about energy, how to solve problems, how to do just about anything through this knowledge and understanding and ability to play with energy. And so when you start to see other people getting results as well, that builds your confidence in the system, which is very different from the way that most people solve problems. I left my second Chinese master in 2012 and moved to Australia. And since then, I've more been developing my own work. I wrote a book called Love Money, Money Loves You. And this is very interesting because similar to what I described about my teachers. What actually happened was I was reading something in a book and it said, "What would money like to say to you?" And that seemed quite an odd question, but I was journaling, so I just started writing, and my pen started writing itself. And this message came out, which was not something I could possibly have written. And it started by saying, "I would like to tell you to love me. I am an energy. I'm very powerful and beautiful." And it went on to explain how it's here to serve human beings. But what's interesting about that writing in this context is that these were not my words. What happened was that I connected with this channel, if you like, or with this energy of money, the subtle energy that sits behind our financial systems, and was able to communicate with it. Just like some people can communicate with trees, some people communicate with some kinds of spirits or angels. There are many ways that we communicate. Some people communicate telepathically with each other. That's very common between partners or between parents and children, even at a small level. I was able, it turned out, to communicate with the energy of money. Came completely by surprise, and I ended up writing a book full of these messages from money. I've been teaching people a lot about that, how to use energy actually to shift their relationship with money and their experience of money. I've done a lot of work around what I call superpowers, which is special energy abilities. A friend of mine identified a Chinese system, an ancient Chinese system, for finding out what special abilities you have easy access to. So I've done a lot of work around that. The main work that I'm interested in is how do we solve problems in ways that are easier and lighter than the normal ways that we do them. When we use our mind, it often becomes very complicated to solve problems. When we go to the next level, and there are multiple different ways of doing that, we can often actually make that problem so that it doesn't exist anymore. Perhaps because we have a higher perspective, perhaps because we move into living in a way where that problem is already solved. There are many ways of doing this, of course. So solving problems, I believe, is really important, that we upgrade our systems for that. And then the other thing is, what is the world that we are choosing to live in? What is the world that I'm creating, contributing to? What am I creating in my life? What is my purpose at a practical level, and how am I doing something about that? And then how do I make that also take account of this much broader scope of being human than just the intelligence? So, for example, my focus is what I call the well-being economy. Through our cognitive, rational intelligence, we have managed to create an economy where a lot of it makes a lot of money out of disease and death and destruction. And it doesn't seem to have worked out the most natural thing in the world, which is, how do we make an economy that is fundamentally based on well-being, the well-being of humans and the well-being of the environment in which we live? Now, that's only possible if you work with your mind. If you actually bring in these kind of capacities and abilities that I'm talking about beyond cognitive intelligence, you couldn't possibly create an economy like that. It's just not humanly possible, because it is the most natural thing in the world for us to prioritize our well-being, unless we have played so much with our minds or had our minds manipulated that we actually override our intuitive and instinctive way of acting and our natural motivation for life. So it becomes especially important, I think, this whole subject, because of the context in which we live. We have, on the one hand, this death, destruction, disease-based economy, and not a living economy or a well-being economy. On the other hand, we have the threat of artificial intelligence and machine implantation to replace some of our fundamental capacities, which I believe runs the most enormous risk of reducing the most important capacities we have, which are not our mental capacity. We will be able to use AI however we want, but reducing our spiritual capacity, our subtle energy capacities, the capacities that we've barely tapped into yet. And this is the phenomenal development that is available to us, the extraordinary potential that is opening up to us now in a way that it never has before, at exactly the same time as we are really in the throes of perhaps a dying economy, but what are we going to replace it with? And this massive expansion of artificial intelligence and machine technologizing of all of life. That's not a mistake. It would inevitably be that as our capacity opens up, as we have more access to knowledge, spiritual knowledge, and the inner secrets of human potential and capacity, it is so not surprising that exactly the same time we are getting this explosion of the material and rational side of that. This is what always happens, actually. We'll go into that more in another episode. But it does mean that it is time to be especially awake and vigilant. This is not a time for being asleep. It's not a time for being passive. It's not a time for just agreeing with whatever's put in front of you. It's not a time for letting yourself be manipulated by media, by other people's agendas. This is a time for the human being, the whole human being, to stand up in our potential and in our natural capacity. It is time to realize what we're capable of, not only mentally, but also through our daily actions, daily life. And that is what this video blog is fundamentally about. It is a call to you to step into the reality of who you are and to develop the capacities that you have, maybe latent, maybe you have started to develop some of them, but to recognize what becomes possible for you when you really give yourself to who you are. This is the leading edge of human life. This is where we so come alive. This is where we feel like I'm living the right life at the right time, in the right body, with the right potential. I'm living my story. This is where you find your sovereignty, the sovereignty of your being, the sovereignty of your soul and your life, and you're able to live in right relationship with other parts of life. This is also a grand experiment. This is not an area where I have all the answers or anybody has all the answers. There are people in the world who have extraordinary abilities. There are people in the world who solve extraordinarily difficult problems. There are people in the world doing extraordinarily challenging things in order to change our economy, our business, our systems, the way we live. But it's when we wake up to that as individuals and start to connect together in this, that it can become a mainstream direction for humanity and give us an alternative choice to continuing with some kind of death and disease-based economy, an extractive economy, but create a well-being economy instead. And to move beyond the intelligence-based view of life into a view of life that is really a life-based experience. It takes account of the richness, the vast array of possibilities that are here for us right now, and supports us on our own life experience, our journey, our creation in every moment, and enables us to live the life that we dream about, not as some kind of fantasy, but as actually a fulfilling reality.